Okay, thanks Cameron, and hello everyone. My name is Jeff Cope. On behalf of the entire RTI Innovation Advisors team, let me say welcome to today's webinar, and we're grateful that you could find time to join us today as we explore some of the opportunities and the challenges associated with cannabinoids. CBD and other cannabinoids are such a fascinating topic to me. There's great promise of health and wellness benefits in topicals and other CBD infused related products. Yet there's a fair amount of complexity and there's a lot of unknowns still to resolve about how to best bring those claims to market and how to do that in a consistent and safe way. We're going to explore all that today, and I'm glad that you joined us to dive into that topic as well. Let me say a quick word about our team and some of the work that we do. This may be your first time engaging with us, so let me kind of set the stage for who we are and the things that we do in our line of work, and then we'll dive into the topic of the day. As you can see on the screen, we describe ourselves as a mission-driven innovation consultancy. That's partly because we are part of a mission-driven research institute called RTI International. And so our mission is to help our clients turn insights into new products, new technologies, new services that can have meaningful human and business impact. We go about doing that through three related challenges that we find many organizations face when they're dealing with innovation. Starting at the top right in the blue box of strategic innovation, we work with organizations who are trying to figure out how do we understand these increasingly complex futures that lie ahead of us. And certainly the pandemic that we're going through right now is one of many examples of complexity that organizations are having to wrestle with and figure out how to become resilient in and build strategic planning around. And we help improve those strategic planning methods by applying futurist methodologies like foresighting and strategic futures, so that we can extend those timelines. We can look out on longer horizons and feel more confident in the plans that are being developed around those horizons. In our insights work, moving around the rocket here to our orange box of insights, we work with innovation and new product development teams, largely to bring the world of the possible into those organizations. We help bring new insights on emerging technologies, emerging growth opportunities, potential partners to engage. They can help make those new products, new technologies, new services, new experiences come to life. And then our third body of related work, our go-to-market work, we work predominantly with organizations who are at the very early stages of technology development. Think about federal labs and universities who are creating some breakthrough technologies that are still at a rather nascent stage. We work with those organizations to help them see the path to market that those technologies might be able to take. We help connect them to partners who can help bring those technologies to the market. And we help them really understand the competitiveness of their particular offering and where it best fits in the marketplace. So that's a quick summary of who we are and the types of things that we do. If any of that sounds interesting to you, we would love to chat with you further about some of your needs that fall into these areas. And you'll get our contact information at the end of the session. So I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague, Dr. Lawrence Blume, to talk us through the opportunities and the challenges in cannabinoids. Lawrence.
All right, great. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate the introduction there. And we'll circle back to these services at the end of the talk and relate them back to the CBD market and consumer products, as well as the use of CBD and other cannabinoids in topical. So we'll revisit this framework and how we work with clients at the end of the discussion here. So I'd like to just thank everyone for joining today. We ran this webinar last Friday, had a lot of great participation, a lot of good feedback and questions that came from that. And luckily for you, we've made some small revisions. We've added some additional content to make this particular event more impactful and really to provide some additional value. Um, there are a lot of webinars out there that are talking about cannabinoids, talking about CBD, talking about the use in ingestible products as well as topical products. So, there's a lot of different approaches. Some of the knowledge is very good. Other knowledge, I question in terms of where it came from. And what we want to do today is provide a science-based understanding of really cannabinoids, the endocannabinoid system, and then focus on CBD. What's the market saying? How are consumers viewing it? Where are they seeing? Where do we see some opportunities? And then dig a little deeper into how the system operates from a scientific perspective, and ultimately try to narrow in a little bit more on how to approach areas of development. How might you approach claims? Although putting claims on products right now is not advisable according to FDA and current regulations, or more precisely lack of regulations around that space. Nonetheless, there are groups that are promoting products for certain reasons and ailments. And so we'll speak a little bit more to how you might actually validate some of that from a scientific perspective. And then we just want to touch on a few topics on how do you wrap this up and what's the approach and strategy that we believe will be successful as you move forward in this space. So before I get into the discussion, I wanted to just take a moment and elaborate on our organization, our parent group, RTI International. And as Jeff mentioned, we're a nonprofit research institute. We've got about 5,000 staff, and we're really a global research center. We have offices at just about every continent and location that we can think of, except Canada. No office in Canada at the current moment. But the real point of this slide is to just document that we've been working with cannabinoids and understanding them from a lot of different perspectives for over 40 years. If you do a PubMed search on cannabis research, we're going to be one of the #1 cited institutes. And the reason for that is, as you see on the right-hand side here, is we work really across the value chain. We look at the characterization of cannabinoids. We look at their medical and their health and wellness properties. We do consumer studies, we look at implications for labeling, and then we tie that all back to what does it mean from a policy, a regulatory, and a social and economic perspective. So there's a lot of expertise in the group. And why I'm bringing this up is I think it's very important to understand where your information's coming from. Is it a credible and reliable source? And that should always be important, but it's even more important in the current cannabis and CBD market space. So let's move to the first section, looking at the market and consumer opportunity. And I think most of you that are on this webinar are well aware of CBD's implication in the consumer market space. It's really been a rising star. You can see it in everything from edibles to personal care to pet products to grooming products, even being incorporated into fabrics. So there's a high awareness among consumers. 95% of consumers surveyed are aware of CBD. Roughly 20% of adults have used CBD in the past 6 months. That in the US, that's over 40 million consumers. From a retail perspective, last year we saw 10,000 SKUs, for products that had CBD used in them. And then consumers, they have a strong interest in CBD from a food standpoint, from a nutritional and vitamin standpoint, as well as a skin care standpoint. So there are opportunities that are emerging in health and wellness. Consumers believe that 75%, so 3/4 of consumers believe that CBD products do offer some type of wellness benefit. And that holds true regardless of the age or demographic group that you're looking at. Some of those leading categories where consumers believe there's therapeutic and wellness opportunity include pain management, stress, relaxation, sleep, healthier skin. Those are some of the top categories. From a brand perspective, brand integrity is growing in importance, especially when consumers look at brands in terms of choosing products. I would say up until recently, consumers were brand agnostic, so there was no loyalty. There's so many products in the marketplace, you kind of pick and choose, and you know, there wasn't a consistency with one particular product over another. But that's changing. There's a shift in who the consumer is, and you know, moving away from who you would typically consider a consumer of cannabis to different socioeconomic and demographic groups. So we'll talk about those in just a moment. And so part of that shift is resulted in a consumer change in the mindset. And so now they're looking for brands that are trustworthy, innovative, and really transparent. So those are successful, those are factors for success in our eyes moving forward for groups operating in the space. So if we look a little bit more closely at this, you know, there's a big demand for the use of CBD in beauty and wellness products. We're seeing that as a #1 ingredient that's really in the forefront of bioactives or botanical extracts. So the growth drivers are really, there's the growing awareness of CBD, there's the belief of the health and wellness properties, there's the entrance of large chains, retailers like CVS and Walgreens, and part of that subconsciously is those large chains, by bringing the products onto their shelves, you'll document to consumers to a certain extent that, you know, there's, you know, trust and transparency behind the product. There's belief that these products work. Now, whether or not they do actually work from a scientific standpoint is something that, you know, we'll talk about a little bit later. Another thing is, you know, a lot of these products are aimed around being natural alternatives to pharmaceuticals. And that's continued to be a big trend that consumers are seeking, looking for alternative ways to get off current medications. You know, the leading categories, edibles is a leading category. Baked goods, gummies, confectionaries make up the bulk of the sales there. You know, but cosmetics and topicals are close in terms of sales and product categories. So they fall in the second category. And then within that space, beauty and skincare products, as well as nutraceuticals and drinks are kind of the fastest emerging areas. So for example, sale of CBD skincare products in 2018 was 17 million. Last year, it was documented to be 311 billion. So significant growth in the number of sales for those products. So who's using and why? So today's users tend to be women, parents, millennials. There tends to be a shift in, you know, a demographic that's older in nature. That relates back to some of the growth drivers seeking alternatives to current pharmaceuticals. Some of the reasons, which also support why there's a shift, is, you know, being able to reduce anxiety, chronic pain, issues with depression, insomnia, and inflammation. So those are some of the top reasons. You know, within the topical space, you know, treatment of acne, using CBD products as anti-aging, pain and inflammation control, and also as a moisturizing agent are the leading, you know, areas that people are using these products in. And you know, we've cited here in 2019, the Arthritis Foundation, you know, surveyed about 3,000 individuals. And what that study documented is roughly 80% of patients, or the survey respondents, you know, indicated that they are considering or have used CBD and already to treat essentially inflammation and arthritis were the two main factors there. So that's great. There's a lot of opportunity, but there's definitely some areas for improvement. And so to round out this story a little bit more, one area that we see lacking is really education to consumers. You know, building and curating a story that speaks to consumers is a white space opportunity in our eyes, and that helps lead to, you know, brand integrity and the quality of your products. So I've got 3 images on this particular slide. The first image, you know, speaks to whether or not consumers understand the difference between THC and CBD. And for the vast majority of people that you ask, they do understand the difference. The main differentiating factor there is, you know, THC is the compound that will give you the euphoric or psychotropic high, and CBD doesn't necessarily have that effect. And so, and just by removing, or dissociating CBD from having the high, there's automatically this, subconscious, idea that maybe CBD is better for you than THC. Where consumers really lack in education and where the story needs to be built is, they struggle, one, for the most part, to differentiate hemp from marijuana. So, many of us that work in this space understand that these are the same species of plant, but by law, hemp is defined as having less than 0.3% THC in its dried material. Furthermore, the type of extracts that are being used in these products, so full spectrum, broad spectrum, isolate. These are terms that you see on labels and groups promoting, but the consumer does not understand the difference and the potential benefits or disadvantages of using these different extracts. And even from a product development and scientific standpoint, it's unclear whether or not certain circumstances you should be using a broad spectrum, which has THC removed, but it has the vast majority of terpenes. Or do you use an isolate that just has CBD? Or do you use the full spectrum, everything that's in the plant flower for the most part? So there's a lot of discussion around which one of these form factors is most effective in product development and for treating certain types of ailments. And that really relates to my third point, which is the entourage effect. And so the entourage effect really indicates that purified CBD has a narrow therapeutic window, and you really need all of the other compounds that are derived from the plant, including the other cannabinoids, the other bioactives, as well as the terpenes to produce the synergistic health and wellness properties of the plant. And there's a lot of debate. There are studies that definitely document under certain situations that CBD has a narrow therapeutic window compared to when you use the full spectrum compound. However, there are other areas where CBD actually performs much better than the full spectrum because you need a higher concentration of CBD to achieve that effect. There's also some challenges that exist across the supply chain. So from cultivation to processing to R&D to the development of products and marketing of those, most of the hurdles are associated with the regulations or lack of regulations and standards. So I'm not going to talk today about the Farm Hemp Bill, the legal implications of that in terms of federal, state to state, country to country. That's a whole webinar and discussion in and of itself. What I will say is that, there's a lot of measures that need to be taken to improve the efficiency of this supply chain. I know there are several groups working on standardization. So how do you standardize the extracts? How do you standardize the testing procedure and making sure that you're getting a homogeneous product and that CBD is evenly distributed and that you have no THC or pesticides or heavy metals? And ultimately, how does that lead to labeling, product quality, and the types of information that you can put on your product? So when you tie these together, there are several points of alignment as well as a few concerns, both from a business and consumer perspective. So consumers are curious about edibles and topicals, but they do have some concerns. Are these products effective? Are they safe? What's the quality? And really youth access is a big one. Not so much in the topical space, but specifically ingestibles, anything that's eaten or gets into the bloodstream. Youth access is definitely a challenge. From a business perspective, CBD helps achieve one of the things that almost every company's after: developing new products and achieving growth through white space opportunities. So CBD and other cannabinoids, and we'll talk about in just a little bit, provide a potential pathway to achieve both of those. So the implications really mean trust and transparency are going to be critical moving forward. Consumers and product manufacturers need to provide more information in terms of education as well as listening to one another. That will really allow harmonization across some of the supply chain as well as across product development as well as labeling. So I'm going to pause there and open it up to Q&A. And Jeff, I'm not sure if anything has come in.
Yeah, Lawrence, we've got a couple questions come in so far, and if you have questions, feel free to use the Q&A button that's on the bottom menu of the Zoom browser. You should see a Q&A button, so feel free to submit questions there throughout the whole session, and we will have frequent stopping points to take those questions. So here's a couple to get us started. So what product categories do you expect will catch on and reach a broad market penetration first?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm going to base that off of where most people are looking to use products and where there's alignment in the scientific community in terms of the strength of being able to use those. Psoriasis and really anything to treat pain and inflammation. I think those are going to be the leading spaces moving forward. Structure function claims and claim substantiation when we eventually get the rules and regulations in place. That's probably a strong and an emerging early opportunity. And then as you look further down, I think there's some potential with controlling oil. So, acne, therapies, as well as moisturizing. And then I would say that kind of falls in line with that, where there's some early research is looking at CBD as an antioxidant. There's some really nice research that came out a few months ago, showing that CBD had broad effectiveness against a number of microorganisms that have implication in skin diseases and other ailments. Now you need to figure out the timing, the duration, how long does it take to essentially kill those microorganisms, but nonetheless, some promising work from my perspective.
Okay, another one come in. What influence, if any, do you expect the coronavirus to have on the CBD market?
Yeah, so we've actually seen an increase in CBD sales, and one of the reasons there is there's a lot of fears, there's a lot of anxiety and uncertainty with us all, and CBD being promoted to help calm and nervousness and help reduce anxiety, being anxiolytic in nature, has really driven a number of consumers into the marketplace. So that's what I currently see. I don't see any issues right now with the supply chain. CBD as an ingredient have actually gone down because of all the biomass that's recently been produced. So the supply and demand will change in the near future here, and prices will probably level out. But those would be my two notes on that particular question.
Okay. Great. No other questions for now. So I'd say let's dive into the science.
Okay, great. So as we move into the science of CBD topicals, there are a number of things that I want to talk about. But the first thing to just mention is there's a host of products. You do a CBD products Google search, and you'll see everything from creams to lip balms to beverages to confectionery, all the way to fabrics infused with CBD. And I think this fabric concept is essentially playing on the idea that CBD has the ability to reduce inflammation and pain. And so these athletic clothing, this particular athletic clothing line has CBD encapsulated and then woven into fabric layers. And so as you exercise, those fabric layers and ultimately the microcapsules break open and provide, in theory, therapeutic relief to joints. So a lot of innovation and creative ways that groups are approaching this. If you look at the core product categories, and so today we're not focusing on ingestible, that's a whole nother category. It's a whole beast in of itself, because then we have to deal with bioavailability, we have to deal with first and second pass liver metabolism and things of that nature. So if we just focus on the non-ingestibles, Here are the key product formats: lotion and creams. Probably one of the biggest areas usually has water and oil mixed together with some other, enhancing ingredients added to the formula. Generally, those are to provide some type of soothing benefit. With the facial oils and serums, most of those are aimed at, face care. Those are generally infused with some type of natural oil, as well as some other agents to improve absorption and delivery of the cannabinoid, or CBD in this case. And then you have the salves and ointments, which are a little bit different. They generally contain essential oils and waxes, and they're a semi-solid nature. And so they're not as easily absorbed. They're a thicker paste. And one of the potential benefits of that is that you can provide longer benefits, longer lasting benefits in that type of product format. And then the bottom category, less popular, but you still see them in the marketplace. There's roll-ons that use CBD. That's for pinpointed application. A lot of botanicals added in to provide calming and fast-acting relief. There are sprays geared towards larger body application. And then there are patches. There are topical patches and there are transdermal patches for very targeted and continuous application. And those formulas really depend on the type of relief and the duration of the effect. And I do want to highlight, topical and transdermal products have advantages and disadvantages, both from a effectiveness and a delivery standpoint. But it's really key, if you're developing a product, to make sure to know whether or not your product's getting into, or potentially getting into, circulation. Because that brings up a whole host of additional factors that you need to consider, both from a risk and a benefit standpoint. And so topical formats, we covered those just previously, but they're not going to penetrate the outermost layer of the epidermis, so they're not going to get into systemic blood circulation, and they're good for local delivery. Transdermal formulas are using these chemical penetrating enhancers, so they're breaking down the barrier layers to allow those actives to get into systemic circulation. They're great if you want to avoid first pass metabolism and provide systemic, essentially exposure to CBD or other bioactives. But there's things that we need to consider, and we'll talk about in the safety section that would relate to transdermal products. So for all of these products, people are promoting and companies are promoting a number of claims, health and wellness opportunities. So we did an extensive look across product categories and industries, and we documented over 100 different types of claims. When you look at those claims from a topical application perspective, they focus really on 6 categories: treating acute pain, treating inflammation, some type of skin health, whether that's acne or scars, moisturizing abilities, serving as an anti-aging or antioxidant, and then contributing to hair health. So as a consumer, I look at this and I say, how could CBD perform all of these effects and be effective at doing that? And I consider, well, is it CBD? Is it some of the other bioactives that are in there? So there's a lot of confusion on how this could actually be true and where the truth lies. And so to understand that, you really have to understand how CBD and other cannabinoids work, from a physiological standpoint. And to do that, you need to understand the endocannabinoid system. So many of you are familiar or have probably heard of the endocannabinoid system, which is essentially our body's own system. But I want to take a step back and just think about consumer education, storytelling, and really how this translates to sound science and product development. From an evolutionary standpoint, the endocannabinoid system was present before Homo sapiens. So some of these key molecules, the ligands and the receptors, appear before we appear. There's an interesting theory going around from a prominent scientific group, and what they're hypothesizing is that we initially had some of these molecules as part of our system, as part of the system, and as we ate more plants that had cannabinoid components in it, it further refined, the influence of our own endocannabinoid system. And part of that is related to the diversity of where the cannabinoid system is and what it regulates. And that's what the first image speaks to. So there's a high prevalence in the brain and the central nervous system, but we really see it throughout the body. And there's different levels of receptors and different levels of activity in different regions, but nonetheless, it has a broad presence across our physiology. The second image really starts speaking about, well, what does the system do? What are the key players? And so the way that I'm going to break this down is there's a couple of key players. There's receptors. Those receptors respond to ligands, which are the molecules that activate the receptors and ultimately begin to activate a response. And then there's the enzymes that are responsible for processing, either making these endocannabinoids or breaking them down. And what we know is that the endocannabinoid system has a tone to it. So our bodies are continuously producing and breaking down cannabinoid molecules to influence that tone. And ultimately that tone leads to changes in the way that we feel, our memory, our behavior, and pain responses, as well as a couple of other things. And so the way to think about this is we each have our own tone, and sometimes the tone is high and we may need to bring it down, and sometimes the tone is low and we may need to bring the tone up. And groups are talking about this from a medical perspective as, endocannabinoid deficiency or hyperactivity, and how that may relate and underlie other diseases such as systemic inflammation diseases, things of that nature. So that's an emerging concept. The third image, and this is really something unique that I just wanted to highlight, that when I speak with individuals, they're not really familiar, they didn't know of this. And so the way that most of our cells, at least in our brain, communicate is you have a neuron that sends a message to the second neuron. So you have a presynaptic that then sends a chemical message to the postsynaptic. So it tells that second neuron what to do. Cannabinoid receptors are located on that first neuron. So essentially they're the gatekeeper and they're the regulator of how our neurons decide to respond. They're one of the very few receptor systems that are capable of doing that. So that has tremendous implications and is just scientifically fascinating from the way that we think and the way that we develop responses to some of the core things that we do day in and day out. From a skin perspective, we have a high prevalence of the cannabinoid system in the skin. There's a homeostatic point. And so we know that cannabinoid receptors and the molecules are present both in hair follicles as well as oil glands. And that there's a role for this system in terms of regulating a number of diseases. And those include acne, dry skin, inflammation, and things like psoriasis. So there's a lot of research going into this space from a therapeutic perspective, and it's it's an emerging area. So specifically looking at CBD, it's a complicated picture in terms of how does CBD produce its effects in the body. This is a really good chart, and there's a link to the article down below that talks about the different pathways that CBD and targets that CBD has in terms of how it works. And the simple point here is it's complex. There's over 60 different targets, and you can see at the CBD has all of these effects, and some of the pathways and potential targets we know, and some we don't. There's just not enough science there. That doesn't mean that the science won't prove to be true. It just means the studies haven't been done. There are other areas where we think we know the pathway and we think we know how it works. However, we may later find out that it's actually not CBD. It could be another active and or it's a completely different pathway and there's something else responsible. Nonetheless, there's a lot of additional scientific research that needs to be done across these areas. So to tie this all together, what does this mean from an evidence and dosing standpoint as you think about use of CBD in topicals? So I've laid out here what some of the key therapeutic or ailments are and where CBD may be applied, and the length and really the strength of the science behind that. And so we have a framework that we use to investigate this. We look at whether or not it's anecdotal evidence, whether it's cell culture, whether it's a specific pathway, whether it's a clinical study, and the soundness of that scientific research to really be able to come up with this type of insight. And so what I want to share with you is that when you're looking at immune responses, CBD is pretty well documented in a number of different assays and experiment types to control immune responses. And that's why when Jeff asked me earlier where I thought the leading indication moving forward would be anti-inflammatory was my answer to that. Pain and itching is another area where there's mounting science in terms of inhibiting nerve sensitivity. And then as you move further down, antimicrobial, skin barrier, hair maintenance, and all the way to sweat and odor, there's less scientific support for both the mechanisms as well as the therapeutic efficacy of CBD. So those would be areas that I would, want to explore further if I'm looking at white space opportunities, but also want to work with the right groups that have the insights to provide, detailed information on how I could move forward. So I'm going to pause there before we get into our final section and see if there are any questions that arose.
Yeah, got a couple for you, Lawrence. Going back to the topical and transdermal delivery slide, a few slides back, are you aware of any CBD products on the market or in development that are using transdermal versus topical delivery?
Yes, there are 2 or 3 that I'm aware of for transdermal patches for a clinical application. And some of that is for chronic pain management, without to name the specific groups that are working on that. Another one is for, a topical patch for treating, I believe it's actually for psoriasis, but it's mostly related to cell turnover and skin inflammation. And then there are several other that are in early stages looking at a couple of other indications. Those are the first ones that come to mind. One of the keys there is the delivery format. What other bioactives or agents are being used, and that's where those groups are starting to differentiate themselves, at least from a clinical standpoint, is developing IP or proprietary formulations for the delivery of those products into the skin or into systemic circulation.
Great. The next question is related to the slide that we were just showing in terms of the sort of state of science.
Yeah.
Of the applications kind of shown in the middle there, so pain, itch, antimicrobial, what of those appear to have some momentum in terms of moving in this chart to the left? To what would I'm going to try to kind of paraphrase this person's question. So like,
okay,
6 months from now, 12 months from now, would the order of these in your mind look different? Because there's a certain amount of momentum of clinical trials. There's a body of research that may bear some fruit in the next 6 to 12 months that might reorder these.
I don't think so. Because if you're thinking clinical research is going to be a key driver, which I do believe, I'm not sure that there's going to be a lot out there on sweat and odor and hair maintenance. I think skin barrier and antimicrobial, those may, in essence, tie together because looking at oil and lipid regulation. And maybe that will tie in hair later on as well as sweat and odor. But I think this chart will relatively, stay the same, at least in the foreseeable future. What I would expect is under each of these broad categories, you'll begin to see specific indications where there's, strong therapeutic relevance and others where it might not be so strong. And so for the immune response, thinking about, autoimmune and inflammatory diseases, I think, psoriasis is probably going to be at the top of that list. And then, there might be other indications, but some of those might not, turn out to be completely true, at least from a CBD perspective. it may be true from a cannabis, because you might actually need THC and CBD, and you might need some of these other phytocannabinoids that we're going to touch on in just a moment to actually bring the therapeutic effectiveness to a level that you could achieve in dosing.
Great. One more,
Okay.
just came in. Can you say a little bit more about the CB1 and CB2 receptors? So the question is, are there both CB1 and CB2 receptors in the body as part of the endocannabinoid system?
Yes, there are. And so I'll just go back to this, and I'm not sure how well folks can see this image. So our body has anandamide and 2-AG, 2-arachidonoglycerol. Those are the endocannabinoids. And so there's a CB1 and there's a CB2 receptor. There are other receptors that anandamide and 2-AG bind to that may ultimately be considered part of the system. For example, when we eat something hot, anything that has capsaicin in it, it activates this TRP channel, this yellow channel in the middle, and that's part of a pain response. And so one of the mechanisms by which CBD and other cannabinoids may decrease inflammation and pain is by regulating that ion channel. So CBD and THC mimic structurally what our endocannabinoids look like. So they're able to bind to CB1 and CB2 receptors. What I can say further is that CB2 doesn't necessarily have a strong affinity for the CB1 receptor. It actually tends to block the CB1 receptor. I'm kind of speaking in layman's terms here, but it blocks the CB1 receptor and actually may reverse its activity. So there could be some advantages there. I think that for the most part answers the question. The only other thing that you'll see in the literature is there is differential expression of CB1 and CB2. And so the classical theory is that CB2 receptors are predominantly located in immune cells and in immune tissue. What scientists have learned, because the cannabinoid field is still in its, is still a young field in terms of, the amount of research that we've been able to do, which has only been since the late 70s, early 80s. We're beginning to learn that CB2 is also present in other cells that are not immune cells. But that's a classical way of thinking of it.
Great. I think that's all the questions for now.
Okay, great. Just want to do a quick time check here. All right, so we have about 15 minutes, and I want to make sure we have some time for final Q&A at the end. So, what's the perspective on moving forward? And the first thing is ultimately, stronger science, especially as it relates to efficacy, safety, and quality control. So I showed the supply chain earlier. We need clear guidelines. This is mostly going to come from the FDA and other federal agencies, the FTC, in terms of how are these products going to be regulated? What's the dosing? How much can we actually put into a product? And what are the protocols and assays to help look at potency, as well as look at standardization of the extracts that are being derived from hemp. From a scientific perspective, efficacy and more studies related to the clinical setting are needed, especially if you're looking to move into the health and wellness and potentially look at claims in the future. And those really need to focus also on safety, both short and long-term effects, because we don't have a lot of data on short and long-term effects in humans as it relates to topicals, and honestly, as it relates to ingestibles. So there's a need for controlled studies, and there's a need to look, at the long-term effects of topicals from the standpoint, and I've noted here that CBD and cannabinoids are highly lipophilic. They have a log P of about 6, so they don't want to go into solution, at least if it's water. So they require alcohol or other types of organic solvents. Nonetheless, because they are so lipophilic, there's a notion that there may be accumulation in hair follicles and oil glands. And there's some early research that suggests that topical administration of CBD, at least from a short-term perspective, does accumulate in some of these glands. Don't know if that could potentially be beneficial or if it could be harmful or if it might not have an impact at all. The way I think about it is, okay, so if CBD does accumulate, it's probably going to be broken down, but then that's going to ultimately influence the homeostasis. And so maybe if CBD can control oil production, and we know that that might have a benefit in acne, that actually might be something advantageous that we want. However, if we're using it for itch, and we know that it potentially can reduce nerve fiber sensitivity, maybe long-term application and accumulation might not be ideal. Those are just hypotheses. I don't know if those are true or not, but that's how I would be thinking about it. And there's a really good study that our colleagues at RTI put out just a few weeks ago, and so they looked at consumer attitudes and looked at products on the market, and essentially they came away with a number of important things to consider from a product development standpoint. So there's a lot of if you look at the risks, there's risks in mislabeling of content. Part of that comes from, you say your product has CBD, but it still has some THC in it. And because although it had 0.3% in the dry leaves, when those dry leaves were then processed, you actually get further refined, you might actually end up with more THC than the 0.3%. And so there's issues there that ultimately could potentially lead to positive testing for THC if they did a hair analysis. And then there's issues with the presence of contaminants. Hemp plants are great at absorbing pesticides as well as heavy metals and having growth of different microbial populations. And so there's documentation that if you're not working with the right supplier and getting the right certificate of analysis, you could have some issues with those in your product stream. But overall, I would say the topicals relative to ingestibles have a good safety profile and may be able to even circumvent some of the issues related to ingestibles. And those are mainly some of the issues that have arisen from the Epidiolex studies, which is the CBD drug on the market to treat rare forms of epilepsy. And so there's data that shows that CBD, when it gets into blood circulation, can inhibit a key family of liver enzymes. These that are cytochrome P450. They break down roughly 60% of drugs on the market, and that there may be some consequences or some effects on male reproductive health. There's some early studies that are suggesting there may be some implications there, but those are too early really to grasp how truthful and strong they are in terms of what are the implications to the market and to consumers. Nonetheless, they're important studies that need to be expanded. So moving forward, what this states to us and what we see from our clients is a shift in mentality, not just taking an ingredient and running with it, but really approaching the space, especially as it relates to health and wellness from a pharmacology standpoint. And so, looking at what effect am I trying to achieve, asking that question, and then what are the actives that I need? Is it CBD? Is it a combination of cannabinoids? Do I need the terpenes? What dose is required? Right now, most doses in the marketplace are probably well below what they need to be to actually achieve a therapeutic effect. I say that because when you look at the clinical and human studies, doses on average would be anywhere from 50 to 200 to 300, and most products have 50 to 100 in the entire product. So you're only getting maybe 2 milligrams to potentially 10 or 15 milligrams. That's not to say in certain indications it might be effective, but right now it appears that it's well below the threshold. And that's important because if you do want to provide an actual effect and you need to reach a certain dosage, you might have to think about how can I get that much in there from a delivery standpoint, and really what's the economic feasibility. as I mentioned before, the cost of CBD and other cannabinoid ingredients have gone down, but they will most likely go back up again. And so looking forward also requires us to look beyond CBD. CBD is the darling right now. It's the hot, botanical and natural active on the market, or in the market. But there's a lot of emerging data that makes CBG, CBN, and CBC really interesting, especially from a consumer and clinical relevance standpoint. Hemp and cannabis plants have, depending on the literature you read, anywhere from 70 to over 100 phytocannabinoids and roughly 500 bioactives in the plant. So we're only learning what those other molecules may do, let alone learn what they could do in combination. So I've just called out, CBN is being looked at for antibiotic properties, psoriasis, bone growth, CBG for analgesia and anti-inflammation, and CBC for relaxation and analgesia as well. So there are a lot of opportunities. The challenge that's presented for us is that these are in very low quantities in the plant. And so there has to be other routes, either crop engineering, which could have product implications, and or fermentation. And there are several groups that are developing IP and have patented fermentation techniques to make these compounds in greater relevance. And so finally, in order to unlock new white space opportunities, there's a number of strategic strategies that will need to be developed to overcome some of the technical hurdles. You can group those into overcoming the physical characteristics and inherent challenges of working with CBD and other cannabinoids. One of them is their aromatic profile. There's a lot of work in the flavor profiling of these terpenes, masking some of the cannabinoid profile, and or using novel extraction techniques to remove some of those inherent characteristics. The viscosity, they're similar to molasses, so they're not easy to work with. They're not very friendly in oil or in water environments, so you have to think about ways to homogeneously dissolve and deliver these compounds. From a processing standpoint, are you going through thermal treatments? Is there going to be light exposure to your product? What's the solution look like? Because these compounds are highly susceptible to degradation. So you may start with 100 milligrams, but by the 2 weeks on the product, shelf life may be down to 10. So those are things that you need to look at. There's challenges currently with blending. And then there's some formulation issues. Dosing control is one that I mentioned. And it's not to say that you can't overcome any one of these challenges. There are some common practices such as emulsification, co-solvency, and other very well-known strategies that can easily be employed to overcome these. It's just a matter of thinking through them from a holistic standpoint. So in closing, our group has worked with clients in a number of areas related to CBD as well as other botanical ingredients, and how do you truly deliver on health and wellness and really deliver a product that delights the consumer. So there are a number of approaches, but to tie this back to Jeff's comments earlier, regarding our services and where clients have come to us, and questions ultimately that groups are asking, from a strategy perspective, it's, how do I enter the space? Do I patent? Do I acquire a patent? Where's the white space? And part of that is, understanding the market. It's understanding the risk and opportunity associated with these products. And then ultimately, how are the regulations going to evolve? And how does that relate to claims and or transportation across state lines? From an insights perspective, it's really about the feasibility of the product, the viability from a business perspective, and really the desirability. What are consumers looking for? And I think that comes down to understanding how the endocannabinoid system works, how application of exogenous compounds, the phytocannabinoids, to the skin and to other areas of the body ultimately can be used to leverage the system for beneficial effects. And, you know, we're going to need to look at the short and long-term effects. Who are the leading research groups? How might you go about, you know, study design? Who might you work with that actually has access to these compounds? And then finally, it's the go-to-market. How do I actually get my product on the marketplace? Who's a co-man I should be working with? How do I vet and select the right type of partners, you know, the right type of ingredient suppliers, and the testing, you know, who to trust and who not to trust? And ultimately, what does that look for? What should we look for emerging technologies to allow differentiation? I know we're just at the top of the hour, so I'm going to pause there and thank you all for your time. Hopefully this has been, you know, insightful and has provided you a framework to look at the space, as well as some useful information moving forward. I'll ask Jeff if there are any questions that have come in.
No additional questions yet.
Okay.
We still have a minute or two. If you've got a burning question and want to send it our way, we'd be happy to help you with any of those next steps that Lawrence outlined.
Yeah, it's really a complex field, and you know, just kind of focused on the U.S. and Canada. That's where some of the data and some of the information from my colleagues has you know, provided insight. The upfront looking at consumers and businesses, but ultimately it's a global market, and you have to think about the supply chain. Where's the CBD coming from? Who has the advantage? You know, what are the implications? You know, we see a lot of issues with, you know, large manufacturing capabilities. Who can be a co-man? And if I make it in this state, can I actually sell it in another state, or how do I get it there? Or do I need to have co-mans in all the states that I want to, you know, work in? So, you know, that's related to kind of the business and, you know, legal strategy. You layer that on top with the science and, you know, some of the other opportunities. You know, it makes for a complicated picture, but nonetheless, there are groups that are doing a really good job and are exceeding you know, expectations in the space. So definitely a lot of opportunity, you know, as a whole ingredient.
Well, let's close with saying thanks again for your time today. I hope this has been helpful to you and gives you a better sense of the science behind cannabinoids, the opportunity that is provided by those cannabinoids, and how they can deliver on potential health and wellness claims in the consumer product space. You've got our contact information on the screen. We will share out a copy of these slides to all the attendees. So Lawrence, thank you for a tremendous job in
quite well.
Your perspective on this really interesting space.
Yeah, I like to see myself as a steward of the science. You know, I had the privilege of working from a scientific standpoint for 15 years in the space, and so it's just you know, time to give back from a scientific perspective to all the individuals that are interested. So, you know, with that, thank you for your time, and you know, Jeff and I are always around to field any questions.
Thanks, everybody. Good afternoon.
Take care.